Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Wicked Podcast. Today, I'm here with Steve Hearsum and his book No Silver Bullet. Hello, Steve, and thank you for joining me.
Yeah, pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
And as usual, we're going to start at the top. So please tell our audience and listeners who you are and what you do.
Who am I? In a nutshell, a consultant, a consulting supervisor, an occasional coach. I spend most of my time really on three things. Firstly, on developing leadership practice. So I believe that conventional leadership development is a waste of time and money largely. Secondly, I run interventions and programs that develop the consulting skills or the change agency skills of often internals who are being asked to change organizations. And the third bucket of stuff I do is probably under the banner of culture. It's that behavioral, messy stuff that shows up in organizations. And I do that through the medium of whether it be consulting, facilitation, sometimes action learning, sometimes one-to-one interventions.
Cool. Yeah. So your book is quite, there's a lot of different angles to the whole silver bullet thing. And I like it because I also, I got this thing of out of the box or cookie cutter and all these things that seem to be really offer themselves as very simple solutions. So let's start with the first question that, I'm sure there's a lot of people out there who, like us and other people, and we know it normally would expect other people to be smart, if not experienced, or the other way around, practitioners, So once you've done 2 or 3 projects, you'll know that life's complex. Organizations are as well because they're full of people, which means they're full of life. And so maybe let's start with why are we looking sometimes at this and would say from the outside that why is that problem not more deeply designed or explored, and why is this seemingly an aspect that feels like stupidity to it, and the definition of that it's like knowing maybe that it's different yet still believing in something else.
It's interesting. So if you ask most people, do they believe there's a silver bullet for complex problems? And let's be clear, we're talking about complex problems here, not complicated.
Yes.
So these tends to be the ones that involve human behavior more than anything else, or the unexpected, like global pandemics or Brexit. That's kind of unexpected stuff. Now, intellectually, the vast majority of people you speak to will say, of course there's no silver bullet. But we don't behave like that. The behaviors tend towards assuming that there is a quick fix or a guaranteed solution to complex problems. It's kind of the myth of fixability, which is an idea that comes from Mark Cole and John Higgins and their book from a couple of years ago. And the myth of fixability comes from a kind of sometimes anxiety-driven need to find a simple solution for a complex problem, sometimes or largely underpinned by lazy thinking about the nature of change. So, if we really think deeply about the nature of change, then we wouldn't be looking for solutions that promise an easy answer. So, for an example, how is it that we think sending somebody away to a leadership retreat at a really nice venue for 3 weekends is going to radically change the way in which an organizational culture works? How is it that we think that spending a fortune on a methodology that everybody in the organization adopts is in and of itself going to be the answer? So the stupidity, I mean, that comes from something called the stupidity paradox, which is a book from a few years ago. And it's the 3 telltale signs they talk about are not thinking about more deeply enough about your assumptions, which links to the nature of change, and also a lack of reflexivity, not asking why you're doing something, so justifying why you've made a choice, and not considering the consequences or wider meaning of your actions. So they talk about, I think it's substantive reasoning, so a failure to do that. So those are the kinds of things that when we're talking about stupidity here, we're not saying that people are stupid. We're talking about people making decisions where if you gave them enough time and they weren't under such pressure and they didn't have such a high need to be certain or to appear to be certain, they might not actually make the same choices.
Yeah, and it's fascinating that it's exactly the thing, isn't it? You go into all these places and say, like, the people I met, they're fairly reasonable, right? And like you said, they all would not subscribe to it yet they do. And you just mentioned a few elements that might be the reason for still ending up in that place. Um, which then gets me to the next characteristic of that, which is sort of, aversion to uncertainty, or the scary aspect of uncertainty. And silver bullet are saying, if this is a, silver bullet, a fix or a finite thing, that seems to give you a certain level of certainty. So certainty is sort of an element of silver bullet, right? So can you talk about bits like that, the certainty or uncertainty
Well,
element of?
I mean, the way to look at this is actually it's what drives the need for certainty. Um, And there are, from the research I did and my own experience, my own observations, there are a number of things, in no particular order. And I'm not going to list all of them because there's quite a few. I mean, one of them is the myth of fixability I've already mentioned, but it's things like the expectations that we have of leaders, of followers, of stakeholders, of all the players here, which necessitates that we put a lot of weight on clarity, on appearing to know as if we're talking about. How often do you hear a leader saying, "I don't know"? How okay is it for somebody to say, "I don't know"? It's not something we allow them to do. Pace, the need to be seen to be doing something right now, the need for speed. We have the whole thing about the archetypes of great leaders. Now, we still have this kind of caricature, the expectation that our leaders need to be fast, decisive, confident, heroic, charismatic. We're still hooked on heroic leadership as being our kind of main way of looking at leadership. We don't tend to get political leaders being, feted or appreciated if they happen to be deeply reflective and a little bit quieter and a little bit more slow thinking.
Yeah.
No, we don't want that. There's the fear and anxiety of failure, and linked to that is the shame if I'm found out not to know as much as I need to, or believe I need to, or others want me to. And nested in that, I think we kind of also have to tip our hat to kind of the need to feel or be omniscient and omnipotent, but also the projections onto leaders that they need to be omniscient and omnipotent.
Mm.
It's not okay for them not to know.
So is
There are
it,
other things as well, but that's a
yeah,
smorgasbord of some of the main ones.
as much as I don't know, there's one part of me that also then still wants to say that I understand all of that, but if you're giving people false hope about, no, it's simple, it's fine,
Yeah,
we're okay, even so, people know, like the proverbial kind of business strategy or whatever. The CEO gives a talk, and it's
yeah,
all, most people who would watch it in the company would go, yeah, it's that kind of thing. It's not very clear. It's all positive spin.
yeah,
And we know it. So no one's ever happy about it. And it feels like a waste of nearly time and space to actually, be authentic and honest about it. So that, look, this is going to be fucking hard.
yeah.
And we're still going to give it a go because we believe in what we do, right? Rather than that narrative. But even on a more, let's say, maybe CFO return of investment level, and that's me as a designer saying that, isn't that madly hiding a risk where you just focus on this one simple thing, you know exactly that's not going to match, and then there's massive potential exponential opportunity for failure and issues that will not be addressed because everyone thinks, oh no, it's that's the thing, that's the box, that's the walls of the box. I mean, is there not ever, what's sort of the, risk management, risk assessment, all of that, which a lot of companies as well subscribe to a lot. Why is that not kicking in?
Well, because the assumption here is that we're all going to be profoundly rational about this stuff. If you look at sort of Dan Ariely's work and the kind of some of the behavioural economic stuff,
Yeah,
Ariely talks about how we are predictably irrational in our behaviours.
yeah,
We like to think we're rational, but we're really actually not. And one story that popped into my head as you were talking, Marcus, was a friend of mine has got many years' experience working in the digital space and working with
yeah,
senior leadership teams. And I remember her saying to me, she said, one of the biggest challenges is you work with a senior leadership team that is responsible for making multi-million-pound investment decisions on technology. But the hurdle, she said, you have to get over is their shame and anxiety that they cannot admit to the fact they didn't understand what it is they were buying. So, that's the level of some of the barriers here, that we cannot even admit that we don't know, that we don't understand. We have to pretend that we have a degree of knowledge and experience and we have the answers, and we behave as if.
mm,
And it's just not possible to say, well, actually, I don't know.
yeah. I get that. As much as I would, and again, I had C-level conversations where I know that, C-levels, they're not always aligned, right? They have different viewpoints. It's really tricky to get the same, even get the language aligned, right? Between, let's say, the CFO and the CEO goes like, no, we're doing vision. And CFO goes, no, we need to have a return on investment. You got some strong numbers here, right? So we all get that. So I understand, there's even the difference in language, and not all C-levels are trained in smart conversations on communications, right? So that's okay, I guess, even so it probably should be better. But if I then look at, you know, scenario building or exploration, I say, look, I'm sure every leader who ever talked to me is fairly aware of the fact that, or let's say C-level, where there's 2 or 3 levels of management depending on size of the company. So they are fully aware that even when we get the reporting in, when you have 2 or 3 hours for looking at how stuff goes, we're getting a very simplistic, abbreviated, or not abbreviated, kind of abstract view of what's going on. I think they would all agree on that. We don't know enough what's going on the factory floor because the level of abstraction is so high and we have limited time. So everything gets translated for us. And we just hope that the translation is just about good enough to make a decision.
Yeah.
So how does is leadership not aware enough of that to say, look, I can actually
Well,
say that I don't fully understand because obviously I'm not talking to every team member in our 20 teams every day.
well, there's many issues nested in that. So I'm just going to pull one thread that's dangling from that. Okay, Marcus. So one of the stories that I stumbled across during my research was of a major US retailer, 2019, just pre-COVID. And the consultant I interviewed said that he was asked by the new CEO to come in and leave his consulting, a small consulting firm, and work for them for 2 years. He said, we'll pay you a fortune, come in, do your thing for 2 years, we'll make you a VP of something, then you can go away and, you'll have helped us. And this guy said, look, I'm really flattered, but I'm going to decline. I'm enjoying what I'm doing. But tell me what's the problem? And this CEO said, look, 2 years ago, we paid big global consulting firm $400 million to help us combat the threat of Amazon and online retailing. It was a disaster.
Yeah.
A year later, so a year ago, we spent, I think, sorry, it was $200 million the first year. The second year, I think they spent $400 million with another big consulting firm.
Yeah.
Didn't work. So that's $600 million. At this point, the consultant I interviewed said to the client, so why didn't you sue?
Yeah.
And the response was telling, Marcus. What the CEO basically said was, well, I can't. I'd never work again. And what emerges is that the anxiety and the discomfort of opening up a conversation about what went wrong and what we might learn from it was greater than writing off $400 million with everything that entails. And there's other stories in the book about the degree to which anxiety is managed in a senior leadership space to such a degree that looking at it purely through a rational lens is useful but not sufficient.
Yeah.
We're talking about psychological and psychodynamic patterns of behavior.
Yeah. But it's not just that. Like, there seems to be also the aspect of the fact that you think that spending that much money on someone from the outside is actually valuable, right? Because if I look back at, and I'm not that, I'm not EY, I'm not McKinsey, I've been challenged on way smaller numbers than that and been asked for what's the value here, and they are not. And also I've seen obviously dynamics where you understand actually what the power consultancies have over companies rather than the other way around, which is a totally different subject and very, very fascinating to watch, if not scary.
Well, but it's related because, and I have had people challenge me saying, look, you have it in for consultancies. No, I don't have it in for them. I have a fundamental question as to the ethics and the viability from a sustainability and capability building point of view of the entire business model. I question whether or not the business model of large consulting firms actually ultimately is of service.
Oh, yeah.
What I have a real kind of curiosity around is what seems to me, and I've seen repeated instances of this, a repeated failure on the part of in this instance, large consulting firms, to even engage in a conversation about both their strengths and their weaknesses, both their light and their dark.
Yeah.
And I won't go into it now, but there are very specific public examples of that. And that to me is more interesting. It's part of a wider pattern, an unwillingness to really think more deeply and think critically about gnarly issues.
Oh, absolutely. And I think at the same time, that's the thing. And I've seen this also in advertising, oddly enough. There's a similar dynamic between advertising agencies and their clients, right? No client ever sued an advertising agency for a campaign not really to function or not. It's a similar odd relationship. That's the same thing. I think I read one article in the last 10 years with that weirdly happened, and it made major headlines in Campaign magazine, right? So these are really outliers, and it's really interesting. It's the same thing. And then in advertising, just as a little extra anecdote, that people like to say the agencies have the clients they deserve. So if they have clients who are very complicated and not very easy to deal with, is usually because the agency acts in a way that attracts clients, where others are clearer and there, and they tend to have different types of clients. It's an interesting dynamic how that matches up. As much as I've seen it, when you said certain consultancies and how many consultancies work for these blue chip companies and how they engage with each other and how they are intertwined into each other is fascinating. As much as obviously, yeah, like I think any organization that is a certain size becomes quite fat, is consultancy or not, and therefore the dynamics become more like feeding accounts and all of that rather than being lean and effective, right? That's just, I think, a dynamic of particular types of organizations. But then, not to letting me trail off this now. So let's get back to one, because you have one chapter there as well, which I was quite curious about, and
Yeah.
in particular, I liked reading that because there's a book as well about, I think it's a Harvard MBA or something like that. There's a book about being in Harvard, about some guy who was
Mm-hmm.
not too much into business going there and saying
Mm-hmm.
like, this is what I saw there, this is what's actually happening there. So you have a really interesting chapter about business schools
Mm-hmm.
and how adequate they are to actually give you some insight and some experience,
Mm-hmm.
or not insights
Mm-hmm.
into, or prepare you for being a business leader. Can
Mm-hmm.
you tell
Yeah.
me a
So
little bit about that, please?
So in the time we've got, I'll keep it fairly short and
Yeah.
sweet. But and to be clear, the critical management studies, which is a subset of the theory and practice that comes out of business schools, people like Henry Mintzberg and Jeffrey Pfeffer, they talk about this stuff and critique the very institutions they're part of. But the overarching critique might well be distilled down into, firstly, that business schools fundamentally only teach that there's one way of organising. The underpinning assumption is that it's market managerialism. That power works in very similar ways. That we have HR, we have finance, we have strategy. This is how we organise. And this, there's a book written by Martin Parker called "Shut Down the Business Schools," where he basically posits this argument that this is a fallacy. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of other ways of organising, and the most useful thing we could do is bulldoze the business schools and replace them with schools for organising. And that what we need to do is create places where leaders can actually have inquiry and conversations scaffolded that helps them become far more skilled at thinking deeply and working with the mess of organizational reality. And my own sense is that, and having done wonderful leadership development programs at beautiful venues earlier in my career, is, and they can be wonderful, and don't get me wrong, they can make a difference, and there are people working in these institutions who are brilliant at what they do, and I count some of them as colleagues and friends. But systemically, the overarching pattern is that I would suggest that most business schools are more interested and behave as what they're doing is they're marketing these particular interventions. They have more to lose by really challenging their clients than they do by maintaining the myth that they are offering great learning. I'll give you an example. I had a client, CEO of a major financial institution, say to me earlier this year, at the end of the 3 days I spent with him and colleagues, I've just come back from 10 days at an international business school with a CEO retreat, and it was wonderful. It was really
Oh,
great.
sure, they're all fun.
But he said, I've learned more in 3 days with you than I did there.
Yeah.
And I got kind of curious as to why. And my sense was it's because the emphasis in some of those spaces is on the stroking. and on the professorial, we're going to tell you about all these great ideas, and it's kind of it's very satisfying from an egoistic point of view, whereas the spaces that I attempt to create really are, well, okay, so what is your leadership edge?
Yeah.
What do you need to do differently? How do you need to show up? And what impact do you want to have? Shall we talk about that?
Yeah.
Well, that means that you need to potentially, you may not please your client. You may actually create discomfort. And I'm not sure that there's enough permission within some of these institutes to genuinely make clients uncomfortable. Yeah.
So I had someone. So I had someone on the podcast a couple of episodes ago who had these COVID conversations after hours over a beer with CEOs, and they really spilled the beans. And he said everyone was very happy to be able to talk like that. And it is a real challenge to have sort of a learning process is there, as much as some companies like, oh, we do learnings, like, no, you're not. You kind of, you have a learning department, but that's not really learning, right?
Well, it's one of the things I say in the work I do, Marcus, is that what I try and do is create useful discomfort in service of learning.
Yes.
My own view is that if you ask most people with anything where they've really learned something in their life, with some occasional exceptions, but normally it's been preceded by a bit of discomfort. There's been some kind of wrestle.
Yeah.
So how is it that we think that we can learn really important stuff about how we show up and lead without there being some discomfort? To me, it seems absurd. One of the big criticisms of conventional leadership development, now whether that's at business schools or elsewhere, is that it's largely performative.
Yeah.
Is that the clients and the learners, they turn up at a lovely venue and they're there to perform the role of learners. And myself, as the consultant or facilitator, I'm there to perform in my role, to bestow upon them my knowledge, and that there may even be a need in me to be liked. It'd be quite nice if I'm liked. And together we collude that if we both perform our roles, that people are going to go away and they will have both learned something and can apply it. Really? That's not necessarily the case. So the performative nature of much leadership development is one of the problems.
Yeah, I think it always seems to be like, tough question to ask, and maybe sometimes just the format. That's the thing where maybe the beers after hours one-to-one work. Whereas if you have a leader standing on the stage, going to the people who sit underneath, going like, "Hey, anyone, challenge me!" Like, I can't challenge you. You're the king. I can't get fired for this.
Yeah.
So obviously the formats are often just wrong, aren't they? And I think what you just said as well, for me, reminds me quickly right into, well, the gym metaphor always works. Like, if you want to work out, you're not going to build any muscle or even stretch more unless you're getting yourself into discomfort/pain. You will not, if you're just going as far as you're already comfortable with, you're going to stay there. It's very simple. I mean, in theory, everyone should understand it, but I think, and I don't know how valuable metaphors are.
But I agree with that. I use that sometimes. There's a metaphor. I was using it today actually. To a client, to a large number of people, you need to work your muscles in this area. And that may be uncomfortable. It's not that you don't have these muscles. It's just you're not working them. And that's. I mean, the other thing to say is it's not a requirement we have to do this type of learning. I want to be really clear about that. But let's take one of the big ones. Let's take culture. If you want the culture to change an organisation, and culture, to my mind, is the sum total of all the behaviours that we're co-creating. So that means if you want a different experience of your culture, you are all going to have to look at your own behaviours. You okay with that?
So no one likes a really shiny mirror, don't they?
Yeah, exactly. So how is it we think that some of the things that we find the most frustrating and painful in organisations can be addressed, if not resolved, then at least made somehow better, without there being some kind of stretch? Now, occasionally they can, and I'm not saying that you can't do things like appreciative inquiry and stuff like that, which is a very powerful intervention, but it's fascinating. If I ever say to a group, we're now going to do an appreciative exercise, I will guarantee you a fair proportion of the group will squirm, because their own issues or some of their challenges are that they cannot bear appreciation. So you're straight into people's discomfort, even when you're doing something supposedly
Yeah.
pleasant.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating how often complex these things really are. As much as like there's so much outside area of this kind of silver bullet area, right? Where you go, all of these things, we all know
Mm,
about it. Why we're not more often stepping into
mm,
it? Which is probably what most of our conversations so far have been like. And
mm,
given that also that given that particular moment, and maybe leads me up to just the right transition. So I always have more questions than we have
mm.
time. So here's the last question. Tell me a little bit more about the really
Oh,
continuum and any thoughts that will wrap this in some sense, even so I know it is a
yeah.
massive.
So that was part of the process of writing the book. It was, I did it kind of as an open inquiry, and I was continually running webinars and having conversation with people and learning about myself. And one of the things that became clear as I was doing my research, I became more aware of the projections that were being placed on me. Now, there's projections all over the place. It's just part of organisational life. But what became clear is in my work was that and I know Marcus, and I'm really clear about this. The way I work is Marmite.
Yeah.
I'm very clear that I'm not the right consultant or practitioner for everybody, because I do not set out to collude with the idea that there can be better sameness. If a client wants things to change but doesn't really, go and work with somebody else. I'm not.
Mm,
It's a waste of your time and money. A waste of
yeah.
mine. So I had several stories then we directly or indirectly were fed back to me. So one was somebody saying to me that in a particular community of practice, I wasn't liked because I speak out of turn. Then somebody else found me really challenging. They said, "Well, you're a contrarian." So I started to think, well, okay, well, yeah, I know I ask questions and I sometimes take the opposite view. Why is that? And somebody else said, and they meant it as a compliment. They said, "You're an agent provocateur." So, okay,
Mm,
well, this is interesting.
yeah.
Because I ask questions, somehow or other, I own my part of this. I own my part of how I ask questions. Sometimes maybe I am challenging. Sometimes, Marcus, I'm just asking questions. That's all I'm
Yeah.
doing. So, what are the projections at play? And that led me into thinking about both myself and the nature of contrarianism. So, in terms of myself, in my head, I realized over the last few years, I have a kind of, it's like an Intel chip. But instead of saying Intel inside, it says really with a question mark. And it fires when I notice contradictions and absurdities. The more contradictory or absurd something is, the louder the voice. So it can be very gentle. It can be like, really? 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 Oh, come on, really? And with varying degrees of intensity.
Mm,
Now, the contrarianism bit was, I started to play with this idea in my head that because of the projections onto me, I kind of went, if you're a consultant of any flavour, how can you be effective if you don't have something of the contrarian about you? The whole point of bringing in an external party to hold the mirror up and ask questions is well, by definition, unless they're just a pair of hands, you don't want them to just agree with you, do you? So it's an invitation to take contrary positions. It's an invitation to ask them to offer alternative views, which then raises the question of how much of a contrarianism can you tolerate? What's too much? So my own view is that if you're not contrary enough, then all you're doing is you're ultimately potentially being passive and colluding. And if you're too contrarian, then clearly you're going to get spat out. And if you're not reflective enough and reflexive, then you may be being clumsy. And somewhere in there, there's the need to really be clear about um, how intense and how pokey to be of service to your client do you really need to be, and at what point are you colluding with them because you're worried about you're going to be rejected, that they're going to throw you out, that you won't be able to pay your mortgage, you won't get any work. So it
yeah.
also talks to the fragility of the consultant,
Yeah.
because bear in mind that if you look at the research, the number one thing clients look for in a consultant is expertise.
Yes.
so so
Well,
how often,
expertise and how you deliver it, right?
yeah,
So, you can
but
have
the research,
expertise, but you might violently share it or just hold back on aspects where
yeah,
you think, is that gonna,
yeah,
you know?
and but they want an expert.
Yeah.
But how often, as a consultant, do you ever say to a client, "Oh no, I think you should talk to Marcus because actually he knows this stuff better than I do"?
And to be honest, I struggle as a consultant with that at times, as much as I think, hopefully, and we all over value ourselves at times. I think I hopefully done it. Like what it reminds me mainly is, and we just earlier had a conversation about, I think your daughter going
Mm,
to Oxford and stuff,
mm,
which is beautiful. So I have a 11-year-old daughter, as I told you
mm,
earlier. The comedian Jimmy Carr here in the UK, he said on a really interesting interview, he said, like, what do you do with kids? How do you manage that and whatever? And it's like, give them as much self identification and let them go out there as much as they can handle.
mm,
Yeah. And you just said that. How much can a client handle? And I find it always fascinating how, so, when you have kids, it told me so much more about being a consultant and
mm,
how you deal with clients, right? Because clients are like kids. It's like how much before they get scared and the confidence
mm,
disappears, and you want to be for them, be there
mm,
for them. But it's sometimes you're like, you know what? Talk to someone else or find it out yourself or come back when you're
mm.
ready. These kind of things are really, I think, very healthy for a consultant points to make.
Yeah,
So I think that's
yeah.
some really great points you made there. Um, so yeah, so unfortunately, I have to wrap this up here a little bit. So all I can say is like this is like there's so much in this book. There's so many different elements I didn't expect to be in there in terms of starting with the silver bullet thing. I thought it would be more technical or more kind of maybe a bit more topical, but there's a lot of extra areas that I was not able to touch
Well, yeah,
upon that are
and
in
and,
there that
and
make it a lot.
maybe just to kind of nail that
Hmm.
is because a central thread to it talks to kind of the unconscious patterns of shame and anxiety that drive decision making.
Yeah.
And once you, if that's given, that's the key thread that I was pulling on, that then ripples through multiple contexts. So it's a very human existential inquiry, which of course makes it a bit more confronting.
Yes, as much as like I like that one of the CEOs I worked with, and we ended up in one of the few really successful projects I was involved in, because they're all very, very challenging. Change is always
Mm.
challenging. You know that. I know that. She said, 50% is communication. If you can talk to someone and
Yeah.
align, you have a foundation. If you don't do that, if you don't have that, you might just as well quickly give up
Yeah.
because it's such a major part of it. And obviously, fears are a driver for having honest conversations and pointing out where the risks are, where the vulnerabilities are, and so on. So it's a very human thing, yet again,
Mm.
isn't it?
Mm.
And I think that's really nice that you brought that human aspect into that book. So yes, I enjoyed it very much. So thank you so much, Steve,
You're
for the
welcome.
conversation today. That was lovely to compress this all into 30 minutes after you had a full-on day with everything. So thank you so much.
Thank you.